Hi everybody, thank you for joining. We're just going to take another minute just to wait for a couple of more people. So just bear with us and we'll begin in about 60 seconds. Again, thank you for joining and welcome to Evelyn Howe's latest webinar, How Do You Get Leaders to Play a More Active Role in Change? My name is Miranda and I'm here joined by my colleague Paul.
Hello.
So just a few kind of housekeeping things before we properly dive into the session. So we're going to cover a number of things today to help you address the common issue that is leaders not playing as active a role during times of change as they need to. So we're firstly going to begin by looking at what usually happens during times of change. Next, we'll look at why it usually happens. And then finally, we're going to look at what you can actually do about it. So we're going to explain some kind of practical tactics that you can kind of take away. So that's the kind of structure, and we'll cover that all over the next 20 minutes or so. We'll be running a few polls throughout the session to see what your own experiences have been. So please do participate in those. And then at the end, we're going to have some time for questions, but feel free to submit those throughout the session using the on-screen function to the right, and we'll answer those at the end. So on the right of your screen, you should also see a chat box. So if you're having any kind of technical issues, please do let us know. But if you have any questions, please submit those through the question tab. And then you'll also see a polls tab, which is where the polls will pop up. So you should hear a little noise and there'll be a little red dot. So apart from that, hope you guys enjoy it and going to get started. So if we dive into the first section, this is what typically happens in times of change. So we're going to begin this section by conducting a poll. So you should see this pop up on your screen or in that tab in 1 second. There we go. You should now see the poll. So we're just going to give you a couple of seconds to complete that poll, and then we'll look at the data afterwards.
Great. So we're going to close that poll now. As you can probably see, the results show that actually everybody on the webinar has answered to the statement, transformations are more likely to succeed when company leaders are active and involved. So there's a unanimous agreement that statement happens to be the case. And there's nothing contentious in that itself. And in fact, so this slide here simply reinforces that. So the concept, so this is taken out of a McKinsey survey that was run in 2015, where when leaders role model behavior changes they're asking employees to make, unsurprisingly, transformations are 5.3 times more likely to succeed. So the data kind of backs up your poll or your own experiences, and the concept that change leadership has a positive multiplier effect. So when change leadership is done well, it has a multiplier effect on the overall transformation.
Hi, just to interject, sorry, Paul. Someone has just commented that there's nothing on the screen. Is anybody else having problems with not being able to see their screen? If so, maybe just send us through on the chat tab. And just there's a couple of people who've just joined in the last minute or so. So I'm just going to post the general agenda in the chat box now. And so that's just for people joining halfway through, so you can see where we are when you join. So sorry, back over to Paul.
Thanks, Miranda. So in the same way, the converse is also true. So where change leadership done well can have a positive multiplier effect, the same can be said the other way around. So this is some data pulled out of a Prosky report, which simply illustrates that often leaders can struggle to fulfill a proactive, active role in change. And so that can have a negative multiplier effect. And what we mean by that is that how leaders perform during change is felt by the rest of the organization. Now, this is a very common phenomenon, so much so it's a topic for a webinar. So let's look at why that happens. So despite the obvious upsides, many leaders struggle to play a role during change. Why is that? The first thing we want to look at is what we coin runaway leadership. This is a term that we use to describe leadership behavior when individual leaders are essentially ahead of the curve, something that's very common in change. And what we mean by that is that leaders tend to get early notice of a change that is coming. So they can be forewarned, or certainly more warned than their teams. But also runaway leadership is a product of leaders expecting others to deliver the change. And we're going to pull out three symptoms or three things to look out for that illustrate runaway leadership. The first one is that leaders, if you find yourself dealing with a leader that wants to see the changes happen quickly and gets impatient, if that's not the case. So because maybe they have been involved in understanding the change before the rest of their teams, sometimes there can be an element of being unrealistic in terms of how the rest of the organization can catch up. A second point to look at is that individuals can be quite time poor and they get pulled in many other directions. But what that means is that leaders can be, or at least come across as, quite distracted. And then the third kind of element of runaway leadership to look out for is that it is difficult to understand what it means specifically at an operational level or for frontline staff. So leaders can come across as out of touch, shall we say. Now, alongside runaway leadership, there is a second kind of major factor for leaders in change, and that is resistance. So resistance is as much a factor for leaders as it is for any other employee. However, very little focus tends to go towards leaders' own discomfort with change. So often in big transformations or complex projects, the emphasis and the focus quickly goes to resistance among employees. However, resistance among leaders is just as much of an issue. And so again, three things to look out for. If leaders are uncomfortable, they will seek reassurances that people will follow them and their vision. So almost going into change, asking for guarantees. Now, obviously, it may not always be a case of being able to guarantee how a change plays out. Secondly, there is also something to look out for in terms of leaders, I guess, exhibiting, like everybody else, discomfort in terms of moving away from established practices. So this is about leaders having a comfort zone with the status quo. And clearly that's going to play a part in the role that they can play in the change. And then thirdly, there is a concern about the risk of the unknown impact on performance of pushing through a change. And so leaders tend to, again, understandably, show an element of aversion to risk. So they're not as maybe risk ready as a change would need them to be. So all of these are examples or symptoms that leaders as individuals can exhibit that all point to why those individuals find it hard to be actively involved in change. So let's look a little bit at how to take action. So we're going to talk to you about three very tactical steps or measures that can be taken to try and address that, to try and support leaders through change so that they can take a more active role. The first one is around clarifying the impacts of the change so that a leader can clearly answer for themselves, are they prepared for what is coming? Now, looking at the impact of a change is an incredibly simple and common tactic, but it is often not executed properly to get the outcome that is needed. So people will often talk about change impacts. However, in our experience, that exercise or that tactic doesn't go far enough. So let's give you some examples of that. So the first thing to do is to conduct a very clear analysis of the impact of each change that is being planned. So the conversation with the leader might be along the lines of, the changes are going to impact these particular teams, and we anticipate that they will impact them in these ways. So incredible clarity, even at an early stage, even if there's some ambiguity as to what exactly will happen, but clarity as to what the impact will be. If you go online, you will find many great examples of essentially change impact assessments. And they fulfill the simple task of what are the changes and how will they impact people. So what do you do with that? I think you have to look to use that change impact to provide clarity as to the resulting implications. And the key word here is implications. So what do we anticipate will happen as a result of that? So the conversation with a leader should be around, we are expecting resistance in these different parts of the business, and we anticipate disruption in these parts of the business. We expect the implications of the change that we're planning to play out in these ways. And then the third and final aspect, the change impact, is the whole point of running through that is to seek commitment from leaders. Now, ideally, that's at the start or even before the start. It could be as early as in a business case. Having said that, it's never too late either. So you can still engage in a conversation around impacts even once the change is underway. But essentially, the whole point of the impact assessment is to be able to have a conversation with leaders to say, are you okay with this? Are you up for this? Are you comfortable for this change to go ahead? But that is a conversation based on clarity around the implications of what's going to come. So that's the first tactic. Let's look at a second one. Now we touched on earlier on the concept of resistance. And so resistance applies to all individuals, not just employees. Leaders too are likely to be uncomfortable with what is coming. So the first step is around identifying the changes that the leaders themselves will face. And that allows a conversation around helping people understand that they themselves will need to go through change. So as a leader, they will have to go through change. These are the changes and what they mean for you. And so clearly that can be done. Okay, so that's over. Apologies for that. So all we were talking about was looking at resistance and working with leaders to identify how that will be experienced. So changes leaders can expect themselves. And then from there, then to kind of understand, so how will those changes kind of make life uncomfortable, or will those changes make life uncomfortable? And there's a conversation around being able to specifically say, what is it in particular that's going to cause discomfort? And again, online, there are lots of resources that can be found that look at the symptoms of resistance and then the root causes of that resistance. But just as an example, you know, leaders may, their sources of resistance might be because they're highly invested in current ways of working, or they've helped create the current way of working, or they might be concerned about more work, greater workload coming out as a result of that. Or maybe in the past, they'd advocated a different route, an alternative approach, and they're worried about kind of how that might appear. Or probably the most obvious is that those individuals, those leaders, have become very successful and been rewarded by working in the current way. And so they might be uncomfortable moving away from that. But there is a need to be able to explore that so that leaders as individuals can also understand, why am I going to find that uncomfortable? And then as a result of that, it's much easier to kind of move into a more kind of forward-looking, kind of proactive conversation around what is it that we need to do, or what is it that you need to do to see through the change? How are you going to see through that change as an individual? So these are the following actions that will help you get ready for what's to come. So now let's look at the third kind of area. So far we've touched on being explicit in the changes that are going to come and the expectations of what's going to happen, looking at how leaders themselves might be uncomfortable with the changes. And now this third part is also kind of looking at how leaders also need to role model behaviors for others. So it's not just a case of what they need to do to get themselves ready, it's what they can do for others. So let's step through that. So the first part would be to actually identify, ideally, behaviors that can be clearly observed that illustrate what we are expecting of leaders. So think of it almost as a checklist of behaviors that are easily observable, that help those leaders understand what is expected of them. This could be given to them as a list or as a checklist, or could be a form of a discussion. This is what's expected of you in times of change. We wrote an article which you can find on our website called All Change Please, where you can actually find a checklist. But just as an example, some of those observable behaviors might include scrutinizing the project strategy and approach from a people perspective, or pushing back delivery timelines if the business is not ready, or considering how other changes going on in the business might impact their particular project. So it is quite easy to be able to identify almost a checklist of behaviors that can be given to leaders to make it easy for them to understand what is expected of them. In terms of then what you do with that, that could be run as a self-assessment. So leaders could be asked to reflect on how do they perceive themselves in terms of how well they do against those behaviors. Or maybe better still, that assessment might be done by their peers or by their teams. So how do others perceive those individuals as performing against those behaviors? And it's not uncommon for there to be a bit of a gap between how the individual perceives their own performance and how others do. And there's value in looking at that. So, what do the results reveal? How, as a leader, do you want to show up during this change? And then as a third and final area, it's looking at the approach that the change itself is going to take in order to leverage leaders in their role. And so there is a conversation that can be had with leaders around, these are all the tactics that we're going to employ. So for instance, we might be looking to road shows, or we might be looking to holding regular forum where you are invited to answer questions, or we're asking you to deliver deliver messages, or to invite impacted teams. And then importantly, not just pointing out what is expected of them, and also maybe talking about what is the support that you as a leader can expect to get. So this is all about being able to give individuals confidence so that they can fulfill their role as a leader in times of change to the best of their abilities.
Okay, great. Thank you, Paul. So we're now going to conduct another poll. So bearing in mind those three tactics which Paul has just talked about. So, change impacts, looking at leaders' own discomfort with the change, and then also role modeling those behaviors and equipping them to do that. So as we did with the previous poll, we're just going to publish it now, and we'll give you a couple of seconds to answer. So please take a few seconds now to do that. So just looking at the data, none of you have said that you have always seen these three tactics employed together in your organization. And some of you have said sometimes, some of you have said rarely, and then no one has said never either. So it's just interesting to, I suppose, see what everyone's experience has been.
Yeah, and I guess to reassert, so these three tactics of how can we explicitly show what the impacts are going to be, How do we help individual leaders look at what are the changes that they're going to go through and get comfortable with that? And then how can we equip them with as clear kind of guidelines as possible as to what's expected of them as role model? Without those, it's probably not surprising that leaders find it difficult to fulfill their role as a leader in times of change as much as possible. So ideally, and this is ideally, these three tactics would be employed in every change and would be employed thoroughly. So the last bit that we're going to just touch on is how do you do that? Or more importantly, who does that? And again, much like with the approach before, we're going to offer you a number of different kind of ways of looking at it because there's no one way. The first bullet here talks about so who gets to work with the leader around those three different tactics. Now, ideally, that guidance might come from a leader's own team. So in those instances where there's a strong rapport, strong trust, there's that two-way dialogue where the team can provide that guidance to leaders to say, have you explored this or are you doing enough of that? That might not always be the case, or in complex programs, it might need to be formalized. So an alternative might be to look to explicitly give a license to the program director or the program lead or the project lead or a change lead, if you have it, somebody involved in delivering the change, to give them license to engage leaders and almost instruct them on the role that they need to fulfill. Again, that might not always be possible, and an alternative would be to actually support particular individuals, to mentor them through their role as a leader in times of change. So to help them explore what is it that they, what choices can they be making, what routes are they looking to go through, how can they make that kind of work more successfully, not just for themselves, but for others. You know, often we find that leaders are almost seen as kind of either untouchable, or the expectation is that leaders should be able to just be able to do everything on their own straight away. But if you explore that assumption, that doesn't make much sense. You know, they require support. So this slide is simply looking at what is the best way to deliver that support to them. So just as a final kind of wrap up, before we allow a little bit of time for questions, if there are any, we've covered three things. The first area that we covered is looking at how change leadership has a multiplier effect for good and for bad. The second area that we looked at is that often when leaders aren't able to fulfill an active role as they should, it is because they've exhibited signs of runaway leadership, so they're well ahead of the curve, they've almost detached themselves from the change, or else they're exhibiting signs of resistance themselves. And then the third area that we looked at was three tactical ways of addressing that. The first one was around being as clear as possible on the impacts at the start, preferably, so as to manage leaders' expectations. The second is to work with those leaders to identify their own areas of discomfort so that they can be prepared. And the third is to then help leaders become role models by equipping them or by giving them observable behaviors that is much easier for them to be able to follow.
Okay, thank you, Paul. So we're just going to give you a minute now to submit any questions if you'd like to, and we'll then take a minute to answer them, and then we'll just do a quick wrap up. So if you want to submit any questions, please do so. So the first question we have is around how you actually take this to your leader. So who do you need to get on side, and how can you get access to the people you need? So Paul.
So I think it's a good question because often part of the challenge is kind of recognizing that leaders need to even fulfill this role. I think one tactic that we've often employed is asking kind of those key individuals, key leaders, kind of what their experiences of previous changes have been, and how well they believe that the changes have kind of been delivered. And often what we find is that there's certainly the answer is that it could be better. And then that opens the door to then have a conversation to say, how can we harness you as a leader kind of better through this change? Can we talk about that? Can we kind of approach you with a particular kind of set of tactics? The important thing is to be able to be clear that this isn't just putting more work at the leader's door. It is actually looking at providing leaders with more support. So being able to make it easier for them to fulfill their role. Hopefully that helps answer that question.
The next question we have is if this would be something you would do with all leaders in an organization or only those directly involved in the change?
So again, good question. I think partly depends on, I guess, the nature of the change. So if this is a kind of broad behavioral change, I think the expectation would be for everybody to be involved. But I think even in that instance, maybe the place to start would be with the leaders who are most directly involved in the change. So they are the ones who've got more skin in the game. They're the ones who have invested more in seeing this successful, and then using them kind of to almost role model what is expected with other leaders.
Okay, great. And then one of the final questions we have is around employing the tactic of clarifying the impacts of the change for leaders. So the question is, will those 3 steps that you talked about really be effective? And is it not too easy for leaders to say they're up for it, but not really commit?
Yeah, so good question. And we see this often. Leaders, individual leaders can get very excited about change and can put themselves out there in a very public way at the beginning in terms of kind of sponsoring a change and almost kind of making themselves vulnerable. But then maybe kind of retreating once things get a little bit tricky or once their attention kind of goes elsewhere. So I think there are 2 parts to this. One is to obviously make sure that the approach you take kind of has to reflect the overall approach that the project is taking. Using kind of the project to engage those leaders. But then also I think it's about continuing that dialogue with leaders. So it isn't something that's done once or one-off or at the beginning. So commitment, you need to seek that commitment, but I think you need to also be able to maintain that commitment.
Great. So I hope we've answered any questions that anyone has. But if you do think of anything following this webinar, feel free to email us at info@labelandhow.com and we will get back to you on those. So thank you all of you who joined, and I hope this has been helpful for you. For any of your colleagues who weren't able to join but registered, we'll be sending them a link to the replay after this. And yeah, any final words from you, Paul?
No, thank you very much. Fascinating topic. Good luck to everybody who's either in the middle of a change or about to embark on a change.
Great. Thank you. Bye.